To remind that you are still under formal oath, Doctor.
Thank you, my Lord.
Yes.
As the court pleases. Dr. Naidu, just before lunch, we were dealing with the question of traces of blood, and that Brigadier Neertling effectively came to the conclusion that
Yes.
the concentrations of blood were insignificant, at least on the clothing. Lord, I just wish to draw the court's attention to the evidence of Mohan Gopal. Mr. Gopal, in his statement to the TRC, that's in volume G, I don't have the volume number with me right now, but my junior will give it to me. 26.
Sorry?
G26, my Lord, volume G26,
What
page
page is that?
17.
Sorry, what page is that?
1768.
1768.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in paragraph 11, Gopal says, I do not know who instructed Dr. Haffejee to take off his clothes, but all his clothing was removed and he was naked when the questioning began. And then if we can move to the statement he made to Advocate Shubnam Singh, which is also in volume G. And if I can draw your Lordship's attention to page 1748. Paragraph 61. And I'm not going to read the whole paragraph, Your Lordship. At around midday, Colonel Kutsia arrived. And then the third sentence. I had to hold him up and help him whilst he did so because he was in such pain. I gave Dr. Haffejee's lunch while in his underpants with no socks or shoes on. By this time he was bleeding, crying and visibly upset. And then the next page, 1749, at the top, paragraph 62. After lunch, the assault continued. They were relentless, extremely brutal. And then skipping to paragraph 63, Haffejee was bleeding, shaking, and could not stand. A bit further down in that paragraph, about 6 lines down, when he was taken to be placed in the cell, Taylor took a towel, wiped the blood from the side of his face and side. And only then was he dressed. So, Dr. Naidu, it does seem that your assessment of the state of the deceased, undressed and in a bleeding situation, is backed up by the evidence of both Warrant Officer Gopal and Lieutenant Taylor. That then suggests that the evidence of Brigadier Neertling may be somewhat, or should be treated with some caution. Would you agree?
Yes. Obviously, I would agree. Obviously, I didn't see the statement when I did my report. That was based on just my assessment. So this is a subsequent, Mr. Gopal, is it? Gopal? His statement is subsequent to mine. So, well, I received it subsequently. It substantiates what I say. So I find it odd that no blood was detected on the clothing. I'm not sure as to why such a test was done in any event, testing the clothing. I'm not sure what the purpose would have been. Was it to minimize the... I'm not sure.
It was apparently to test for signs of blood.
But was there... Forgive me, I'm just asking because out of academic curiosity, I mean, what would that show to the court, to the police at least? I have no idea.
Well, I imagine that if blood was detected on the clothing, then it may indicate that that blood was shed under interrogation.
I see. All right. Yes. I would have thought that abrasions are expected to bleed from the various surface injuries. There would be some bleeding, but I thought it would be taken for granted, but I can understand that. Thank you.
Yes. My Lord, from the side of the family, we will be submitting in due course that Brigadier Lothar Paul Neertling, who then became Lieutenant General Lothar Neertling, and the head of the National Forensic Science Laboratory of the former South African Police, will be submitting that he was Mr. Fix-It-in-Chief. He was little more than a cover-up artist. And my Lord, we will be submitting a report that is being compiled by our private investigator, Brigadier Marion. And that report will suggest that Brigadier Neertling was not only thoroughly dishonest, but a seasoned killer himself. And that he has been implicated by Dirk Coetzee, amongst others, in multiple murders through the provision of poison drops for the killing of anti-apartheid activists. Dr. Naidu, if we can move on, but while we're dealing with Mr. Gopal, I understand that Advocate Singh or somebody from the NPA or perhaps the SAPS asked you to compile a supplementary report in the light of the statement provided by Mr. Mohan Gopal. My Lord, that was handed up yesterday as Exhibit L5. And Dr. Naidu, you prepared this supplementary report on the 24th of February 2021. And I don't want to spend too much time on it. We have dealt with some of the issues arising, such as the question of blood and the stripping of clothes. I do want to draw your attention to paragraph 5 of your supplementary report. There you make reference to the methods of torture that Gopal described the security police in Durban used on what appears to be a routine or regular basis. And although he claimed that these were not necessarily used on Dr. Haffejee, they included assaults with rubber batons and truncheons, electric shocks administered to the groin, nipples, back of the head, sides and back of body, restraint with iron shackles on hands and legs, the helicopter method, and meal kicks. Now that you have closely examined the post-mortem report in relation to the visible injuries,
yes,
do do those injuries potentially reflect such treatment
On Dr. Haffejee?
on Dr. Haffejee?
I believe it does. There are some aspects that I can't confirm. For example, electric shocks administered to the groin, that is typically the scrotum and the testis. But I must draw the court's attention that by a pathologist, if you're not looking there, you may miss it. So looking at the scrotum and the testis and the penis, you may miss those areas, and even in the buttock cleft or between the thighs at the perineum. Even with experienced pathologists. But aside from that, my lord, I believe that most of those, including sleep deprivation, because this ran throughout the evening and until late at night. So I think that is very likely that these were perpetrated on Dr. Haffejee.
And you've already expressed your views on the possibility of the helicopter or aeroplane form of torture being applied to Dr. Haffejee, given certain of those linear injuries on the back of the knees.
Yes.
Can I draw your attention to paragraph 7, and in fact on the top of the next page, you make reference to various kinds of horrendous abuse that Dr. Gopal described. And then you mention that when Dr. Haffejee, that's the last line, was asked to undress, he had to be assisted by Gopal, as the doctor's entire body was sore and he could not bend, and Gopal had to pull the underpants up. Now, if he could not bend, how could he possibly have been in a position to do the contorting 360 degrees twisting while suspended from that lower rung?
It's definitely my belief that the condition of the deceased after all those assaults, not just by Mr. Gopal's indication of their methodology, but from what I found is telling me that he was in a desperate state of illness and infirmity, and probably bent over double in pain, unable to stand up straight, and by that time in a state of exhaustion, physical exhaustion. I can identify with this because I did a similar case, my lord, if I may just divert. I did a similar case just only 2 years ago in the Gambia, where the deceased in the case that I did the autopsy in was captured on video after the brutal assault. And one could see the exhaustion, the sweating, the nervousness, the anxiety, the inability to speak, the loss, the drifting off of consciousness into state of unconsciousness in that case. This is very similar here. It's a very bruised and battered man, and certainly he would have needed hospitalization just to recover, to repair from those injuries.
Yes, indeed. And Doctor, you mentioned that unless the genitals were closely examined, you wouldn't necessarily pick up that electric shock torture had been applied.
Yes.
And in paragraph G of your supplementary report at page 3, you mentioned that unless one specifically dissects and looks for bruises at the genitals,
yes,
these may be easily missed.
Correct. the other thing about the scrotum is that the scrotum, because of its smooth muscle, it folds and scrunches up, and that's why it's so stretchable. It folds and scrunches up at the skin, and it can mask the injury, the electrode injuries on it.
Doctor, if we can move back to your main report at page 19. Where you talk about the distinct pattern or sets of patterns, and you speak about the clustering of injuries. I don't want to dwell on these paragraphs in any detail because I believe we have dealt with them fairly extensively between today and yesterday. But could you explain to the court the significance of these patterns or clusterings of injuries?
Yes, my lord. Thank you. I noted in my report that it cannot escape notice, and this is pattern recognition. And that is where I believe I differed with the previous pathologist, because it's a pathologist's role to recognize patterns. Now the clustering around the elbows, both elbows, almost mirror images of the clustering of these abrasions or imprint abraded bruises in a circular manner, and then also the right knee. I'm not too sure what it does, but it does suggest a pattern. I thought it might be shackling, or it might be the nature of application of a device, or it could be electrodes. We can't exclude that. Just whilst I'm there, Prof. Gordon also testified, and Dr. Biggs also testified about the die-cast appearance. I use the dough and the coin as extreme, but of course these are little surface, well-demarcated surface bruises. So each one might denote, and particularly those at the back described as rectangular by Prof. Gordon, and he indicated his bewilderment about them. So I believe that might indicate specific, directed, intentionally applied force or electrodes. I'm not sure. The ones over the back are accompanied by lots more bruising. So I would like to think at the recess of the back, at the small of the back, I'd like to think that's for physical violence. But the one on the elbows and on the knees, I'd like to think that the court must consider electrical injury as a fairly high possibility.
So electrical injuries, and there, just to cut to the chase, we're talking about the possibility of electric shock treatment.
Electric shock treatment, yes. By electrodes.
Unless there's anything else to add on that section, Doctor, can we then move to page 20,
Yes.
That's paragraph 42. And you reach a conclusion here. You say the visible injuries alone may not necessarily indicate the full extent.
Sorry, Mr. Vani.
Yeah.
There's something that I wanted to ask the doctor.
Yes.
Pertaining to, you described a bruise just below the, I don't know whether below both jaws or it's only on the right-hand side, which you thought maybe could have been caused by the deceased himself trying to
Yes.
loosen the
Ligature.
The ligature.
Yes. There were two sets.
Was it on both sides?
No, just on the right side. The one that you described, there are two sets, my lord.
Yes.
The one that you described, just underneath the mandible,
Yes.
the edge of the lower jaw mandible, underneath or at the edge, and at the anterior front of just this muscle here. They are very superficial, and I was of the opinion that one must consider that the ligature traction component will have been pulling from here. The twist would be here most greatly. So that would be associated with the ligature pull. But in addition to that, Your Worship of my Lord, Professor Gordon's describes crescentic, slightly moon-shaped, half moon-shaped abrasion. I think he described 3, and I'm not really sure.
Is
of
it
the
on one
alignment.
side of the neck?
Yes, on just the front of the neck.
Front of the
And
neck.
the front of the neck, on particularly above the ligature. He said above the ligature. So I'm not sure whether it's horizontally aligned or vertically aligned, because that's not completely clear. But
Okay.
Professor Gordon's impression, his statement was that when the deceased, because it was found above the ligature, the deceased grabs onto the ligature to adjust the collar.
Yes, that's what he believed. But I just want your own opinion there.
Yes, that's right. What I found disconcerting was that the pathologist should at the same time should indicate that it can also occur. In fact, I think it's more frequent in homicidal strangulation, where the deceased is trying to release the pressure on the tightening ligature. Thank you.
Yeah, that is what I wanted to clarify. Now, if I accept that as a probability, that means the deceased was alive then when the ligature was put around his neck.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes, so one has to have that scenario, that he was alive to have.
I just wanted to clarify that part.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, Mr. Van.
As a court, please. So, Dr. Naidu, you reached the conclusion at paragraph 42, page 20,
Yes.
that the visible injuries alone may not necessarily indicate the full extent of the physical impacts of the body, and there would likely have been more than the number of injuries visible.
Yes.
So, how did you reach that conclusion?
Yes, it's well known, my Lord, that, and actually this is a term that I have created, but it's a well-known concept that an injury is only visibly seen or manifest as an injury when the force exceeds the wounding threshold of that per area. An example, if I may have the latitude to explain, would be, for example, the eyelid, the upper and lower eyelid are delicate tissues. They need much lesser force than to cause an injury or bleed or bruise than perhaps the region of the shoulder. So there's a lower wounding threshold than here at the shoulder. There's a lower wounding threshold of the eyelid. Now, be that as may, so it is more likely in most cases of assault, generally, that the deceased or the living victim could have received more impacts than that which is manifest. So if you count 3 bruises over the face, different positions, it may well be possible that the victim of the assault could have received more than that, but just those 3 were heavy impacts exceeding the wounding threshold of that area. In Dr. Haffejee's case, it's difficult to count the number because you've got a little views of the body here and there, but I used the diagram, which I very carefully constructed, and I said and I worked out that it's probably between 60 to 75 individual wounds, bearing in mind that some of them could be clusters of wounds produced by one impact. Possible. But let's assume there are 60 wounds on the body, or 60 strikes. There could have well been easily 120 strikes, but 60 of them fell below the wounding threshold for the region of the body. Therefore, it's always the principle that what you're seeing may be more often much less than what the number of blows that you actually, that the victim actually received.
But Dr. Nadi, do you agree that it is still enormously significant that between 60 and 70 of those injuries rose above the threshold for visible wounding?
Indeed. Thank you. Yes.
And that suggests that Dr. Haffejee was treated with incredible and unrelenting barbarity during that period.
That would be, in my opinion, as a general observer, I would come to that opinion. But I am an expert, medical expert, so I want to just be objective. I would say the victim, Dr. Haffejee, was extensively beaten multiple times. Yes.
And while we're talking about the threshold for visible wounding, would I be correct in saying that certain lesser forms of assault that we have heard about in this inquest and others, such as strikes with an open hand, the so-called slaps,
yes,
that some of those, or many of them, would fall below the threshold for visible wounding?
Oh yes, definitely yes. Especially steps to the side of the face.
Yes. If we could then move to, well, in fact, before we move to the your views on the magistrate's conclusions on cause of death, if we can just deal with two other matters, namely the knots and the question of the dentures or the dental
yes.
bridge. You were asked during your preparation for your testimony to consider this aspect.
Yes.
And I understand that you did examine the photographs of the fixed partial denture or bridge. Did you actually see the bridge in question?
I haven't seen the bridge, but I managed to get a good impression from the photographs.
All right. Well, in fact, that bridge is an exhibit before this court. We did ask the investigating officer to let you have sight of it, and if you still wish to see it, that can be arranged. You did prepare a set of comments,
yes,
which we've handed up as Exhibit L8, my lord.
Yes.
And you mentioned that you did consult with an experienced specialist periodontist in Durban. I don't want to deal with the entire report, just the most salient aspects. So, for example, in paragraph 4 of your supplementary report on the dentures on page 2, you mentioned that the cracking of the adhesive and loosening of the bridge attachment may occur as a result of eating trauma, such as a bite upon a hard piece of food, or an accidental knock or bump on the lips, and that the force doesn't have to be that extensive as a massive blow to the face. It could have occurred through relatively mild impacts. Is that the view of the periodontist? And
Yes,
do you
I was
concur
just
with it?
recounting the periodontist's impression of the possibility of dislodgement by trauma. Because I didn't have that experience myself
Yes.
with the denture.
Right. And you also make the point that from a purely forensic observation point of view, that post-mortem handling of the body cannot be excluded as the cause of the loosened dental bridge.
Yes, that's correct. That's from my experience, yes.
Is that because bodies are sometimes handled in a rough manner?
Unfortunately, yes.
And you also make the point that not counting the scalp injuries which we've dealt with, but on the face itself, you say that there's an absence of orofacial trauma,
Yes.
and that you would have expected to see a blunt impact on the lips.
Yes. If I may explain that, the inside of the lips are very delicate, and on an impact against the teeth, they crush against the sharp edge of the teeth. So it's very easy to rupture, to lacerate, or to tear, or to burst, or split a lip. In fact, it occurs very often without fractured teeth. Now, if there was impact whilst alive to Dr. Haffejee to dislodge his dentures, because the dentures are 4 false teeth, they're floating, but sitting supported by a bridge on 2 canines. So the toe posts are the 2, it's an inverted bridge, posts are the 2 canines, and it's cemented onto the canines. So I'm told that even a hard bite sometimes, but it's got to be a really hard bite, can crack the cement and they can become loose. But I've got no experience with direct trauma. All I know is that if he had sustained a blow that dislodged that, I would have wanted to see there's some sort of injury on the inside of the lip, which is not reported.
In paragraph 7, you don't seem to be excluding the possibility that some kind of trauma or blow to the face during interrogation could have dislodged the bridge.
Yes, I just said, but I cannot exclude an open mouth trauma, or inadvertently if the denture was struck without striking the teeth. On the other hand, remember that the deceased had a thick moustache. I'm not so sure whether there was a bit of swelling and the face was not... Clearly, the moustache was not shaved at the autopsy. I'm adding this on. I didn't mention this on this, right? But by the way I'm thinking, that the bit of swelling of the upper lip might have been as a result of an impact to the face. I am quite surprised, of course, that, with due respect, my lord, that with all the injuries of the body, there's nothing to the face. I'm not sure what conclusion to draw. It is quite surprising.
Yes. Well, we will be submitting to this honourable court that in fact it was a tactic of the security branch when interrogating security detainees to avoid injuries on the face itself for obvious reasons. But if the deceased had sustained blows to the face, perhaps with an open hand, as in slaps, which didn't quite reach the threshold that you have spoken about, could those kinds of blows have dislodged the bridge?
It is possible. It is possible it could have been dislodged by a side blow that swiped against the teeth. It's quite possible.
Because in that case, then you wouldn't have received a blunt injury on the lips itself, perhaps explaining why there's no such injury.
Well, not the direct crushing effect, but a side impact. Yes, that's quite possible.
And on that score, this court has heard the evidence, or has received the statement of one Dr. Rabindranath Bukhan. He was the doctor, in fact, who re-cemented the bridge into the teeth of Dr. Haffejee in January of 1977.
Yes.
And my Lord, we make reference to his second statement, which is at volume G19, and we're at page 1514A. My Lord, that was one of the pages that was discovered subsequently and had to be inserted. So it was handed up to your Lordship earlier this week. And Dr. Bukhan describes the partial denture as follows. They would have been hooked on either side of the existing teeth from the inside of the mouth. To have them loosened again would have required tremendous force. In my opinion, to be loosened towards the inside of his mouth, tremendous force would have had to be applied directly to his teeth. When I applied the cement to his dentures, it had hardened within an hour. It was reinforced on either side, in brackets canine teeth, by a set of hooks. And he says, I never received any complaint from him again to say that they were loose. So Dr. Bukhan is suggesting that considerable force would need to be applied. And while we're dealing with the evidence of dentists, we also heard from a dentist based in India, Dr. Vinay Hazare, who had been with Dr. Haffejee while he was studying in India. And in fact, when Dr. Hazare visited South Africa some years after the death, the family donated the dentures to him, which was then placed in display at his college in India. And in his evidence, he says that he has been a dental profession for over 40 years in various capacities as a clinician, teacher, researcher. And he says that considerable force is required to dislodge the fixed anterior partial dentures, also called as the bridge, suggesting the sadistic torture and assault had to be applied to the face of Dr. Haffejee. He even went to suggest that the 6-unit anterior partial denture, also called the bridge, requires approximately 438 Newton force to dislodge. So that's the evidence of two dentists. Your response?
I think on that I've reached the limits of my ability to comment here. I think this is out of my scope. I can't exclude it. All I can say is that they're the ones that, if they're the ones that were acquainted with the denture that way, so well acquainted, the academic in India and the practitioner here. Perhaps the academic in India is one that created the denture. They would know very well, and their concern can't be disregarded. That's something I can say.
Yes.
Yes.
To be clear, I don't think that Dr. Haffejee himself manufactured the denture. I think it was. I think the evidence suggests it did happen in India, but not necessarily that particular dentist.
Sure.
If we can move on to the question of the knots in the ligature. And my Lord, just to refresh our memories, we submitted into the evidence yesterday an academic article by a Robert Chisnell titled Distinguishing Between Homicide and Suicide Knots and Ligatures, a comparative analysis of case and survey data. That article was put up as Exhibit L6. My Lord, we did ask Dr. Naidu to consider that article and to respond to it, and he kindly put together a note titled Commentary on the article. And my Lord, that commentary was put up in evidence yesterday as Exhibit L7. Now, Dr. Naidu, I know from the disclaimer in your commentary you're not a ligature knot specialist, but nonetheless you did make some comments on the article, and I'll just highlight some of those comments. You make reference to Table 11 at page 224 of the article, where strangulation was more likely in external tying cases and not likely in self-tying cases. You also highlighted a reference at page 214, noting that the article did not consider ligature twists and the number of twists, but did look into ligature tension, where it was stated, in all homicides involving strangulation with knotted ligatures, the neck ligatures were tight or extremely tight, smaller than the relaxed circumference of the neck. Would you agree that in this case the knotted ligature could be described as tight or extremely tight?
Yes, from my observation of the photograph, it definitely was a very tight ligature. Extremely tight, as in Prof. Gordon's words.
Yes. You also noted another reference on that page, which I'll quote: suicides were more frequently characterized by loose neck ligatures and the presence of an inverted V mark in the soft neck tissue. Was there such an inverted V mark in the soft neck tissue of Dr. Haffejee?
No, it wasn't present. No, it wasn't present.
And then finally, in relation to homicidal strangulation, the incidence of tight, self-tied neck ligatures were lower than loose ligatures. Sorry, that's in the incidence of suicides, which would seem to be consistent with what Mr. Chisnell has been saying. Do you have any other comment on the question of knots and ligatures?
Yes, I think maybe to add, that's a good analytical article. In fact, it's a novel first-time article on knots and ropes in this way, a big review. Although it's still, there's lots more to be found in more research. Just from experience, my experience, and from the accounts of the very many textbooks that I've read, a ligature like this I can't recall being recounted in a case of suicide. So this is very unusual, the manner of application of such a tight ligature. It's extremely unusual. It just doesn't fit the normal suicidal patterns.
And Dr. Naidu, in your experience of suicides more generally, have you ever come across before the use of a handkerchief, as we saw in this case?
No, I think I haven't. It would just depend on the number of scenes you've been to, because when we see them at the autopsy, we don't get to see the scene, but based on a few scenes that I've been to, and based upon the accounts in the leading authoritative texts, this is unusual. I believe it might be possible in, well, that will be self-application, in the autoerotic type of deaths, where it's a well-planned, structured way of creating that mechanism for partial or partial asphyxiation, but it's not recorded. It's not something that's common in suicide.
Thank you, Doctor. Could we move back to your main report on page 21? Well, that'll be paragraph 43. Which is titled Professor Gordon's Views and the Magistrate's Conclusions on the Cause of Death. You mentioned that Professor Gordon's view that the death was consistent with, one, hanging, and secondly, that the injuries other than those attributable to the ligature in no way contributed to the death, which was accepted by the magistrate, is most troubling to accept. Why did you describe that as most troubling to accept?
I adhere to that. Even still, it's troubling. Some pathologists might feel, or some people might feel, that an injury is significant if there's a visible disruption of tissue, like a lacerated liver or a broken bone, a visible disruption. But I tend to forget the physiological effects of injuries that don't manifest with disruptions and breaks and bleeding, etc. So this is a very serious set of injuries. And in patients who survive just from the physical injuries, I've seen changes, if they do survive, I've seen changes in the kidney and the liver as a result of the bodily trauma that they survive, that they sustain. That's one. The second thing is the abdominal injury, the thoracic injury, and the head injury are individually and combined severe injuries, very severe injuries. I'm not sure why Prof. Gordon in his testimony also alluded, and he conceded, perhaps by, I think, Dr. Cooper's questioning, that the bruising over the upper front of the sternum, the sternal notch, was also serious. I'm not sure what would have caused. It's a very unusual place to have a bruise, the sternal notch. there might have been an attempt, or I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure what would have caused that. Now, this deceased could have died from the abdominal injury, or from the thoracic injury, or from the head injury. They could have contributed to the death. In that order, I think the abdominal injury is the one that I was particularly troubled by. And then the cumulative effect of those injuries on the physique and the state of health and the fragility of that person. Certainly, the one problem was that Prof. Gordon talks about them being very superficial. I think I covered that. But surface wounds are by nature superficial. It's what they imply to the internal part of the body that is important. So I certainly wouldn't call these injuries minor.
Yes, and Dr. Naidu, we intend to submit to the Honourable Court that yet again, the conclusions of Professor Gordon that death was consistent with hanging and that the injuries not attributable to the ligature were minor in nature were fundamental errors. Would we be wrong in making such a submission?
I believe so. I can stand by that. As a forensic pathologist, I'm still trying to establish why Professor Gordon would call them minor in nature, and why, although in his testimony at places he talks about, yes, he concedes they're significant, each injury is significant, and more so by the use of the term consistent with hanging, because this was not hanging in the way we know hanging. And this was strangulation by ligature. Note, I'm stopping there from the medical evidence.
Yes. So it's a surprising error, but nonetheless a fundamental error.
It is a fundamental error.
And let's now turn to your concluding statements on the last page of your report at page 22. You appear to take issue with the magistrate's finding that there was no motive to kill. You seem to be pointing out that, well, in cases of death in detention, the question of motive doesn't arise because death can be quite sudden and unexpected.
Yes, my lord. And the reason I asked for just that, this is an opinion on a magistrate's judgment, if I may be allowed that latitude to comment, because this I was just give the medical perspective to that. My lord, a lot of the cases of deaths in custody, and I'll be open with it, where the police are using the asphyxiation methodology, either with a tube or with a plastic bag or with a envelope around the face, or what was that board? Whatever asphyxiating method they use water, immerse faces in water with the nostrils, etc., where people are almost asphyxiated. In those cases, my lord, the methodology doesn't produce injuries. By putting somebody's head in the water, by using a plastic bag over a face, by putting them, what is that? May I ask, what is the name of that board they call?
Waterboarding?
Waterboarding, yes. Thanks. Whatever that, it doesn't produce injuries. But the propensity to cause death is so easy, it's just passing a point of no return. So persons who die from any asphyxial method, maybe the tubing, just let's call it tubing, whatever it is. When they die just like that at a moment's trigger, and you don't see any injuries, and you don't see any manifestations, but if they live, they also recover with no manifestations or minimal manifestations. There are some that have some changes in the neck, etc. Hence, what happens in the cases that I've done, and this is my feeling, I'm just going to summarize, what happens, the beating or the asphyxial methodology is such that the police don't know who are applying this. So it's usually police custody deaths. They do not know when the line is being reached. So the person either dies or person either survives completely. So in the few cases that I've done, I don't think I could see that there was a motive to kill. It's just that they didn't know when to stop.
And Doctor, was that a possibility in this case?
But you can't exclude that possibility.
And indeed, you've put up 3 possibilities of where Dr. Haffejee could have died
Yes.
under torture.
Yes, I do. Hence the lack, what I'm just to summarize, the lack of a motive to kill, I thought, and for a legal sense, was a sad reflection, was sad judgment to make that there was a lack of a motive to kill, because there is usually not necessarily a motive to kill. It's just that the torture might usually have been taken too long, too far.
Yes. But if I may play devil's advocate, Doctor, and given your evidence on the head injury by way of example, if Dr. Haffejee had been reduced into a state of unconsciousness where he couldn't be resuscitated, or if he had developed brain injury as a result of the trauma to the head, which rendered him incapable of standing, walking, talking, that may very well have provided a motive to kill in order to cover up that treatment.
Oh yes, a subsequent motive, yes, yes. That one can't exclude.
Potentially leading to the staging of the hanging.
Yes.
Through the strangulation in the cell.
Yes.
If we can just carry on to paragraph B of your conclusion. You make the point which you made before, so I won't dwell on it, but you point out that he wouldn't have been in a position to carry out the procedure involving the ligature, given his physical condition, the pain and distress he was in. And if that was accepted, then if he did do it, you suggest that it would have been an impelled or driven suicide, or as we sometimes say in law, an induced suicide.
Yes.
In order to escape further abuse, a detainee takes his own life. But I want to put it to you that that possibility in this particular case, well, I suppose it can't be completely excluded. But if we accept that on the basis of the rigor mortis assessment, which places his death at between 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. and midnight, that then excludes the possibility of Dr. Haffejee committing suicide, because he was then in the hands of the security branch members themselves, and on their own version, and there would have been no opportunity for him to commit suicide in their presence, removing that possibility altogether.
Yes, if one looks at the time sequence, then if that possibility then won't exist with that time scenario of having died, if he died between 10 and 12 or thereabouts, in the custody of the security branch members themselves, yes.
Yes.
One can hardly see that possibility as having existed, yes.
Indeed. And then finally, you conclude by saying that the deceased was, to a great possibility, either unconscious or actually dead at the time of the ligature constriction, and serious consideration must be given to the possibility of a homicidal slinging of the body in the position he was found. And we would agree with that conclusion, particularly in the light of the time of death, which rules out self-inflicted suicide.
Yes, I think that definitely fits my impressions as well. That you cannot rule out that he was either unconscious or already dead at the time.
Thank you, my lord. No further questions.
Mr. MacDonald?
Thank you. My Lord, the state has no questions. The doctor has covered via his report comprehensively all the aspects that the state wished to canvass. Therefore, all has been covered.
Thank you, Doctor, for your time.
Thank you, Lord.
You may be excused.
Okay, thank you, my lord.
Should we adjourn for Monday?
My lord, just a quick housekeeping matter.
Yes.
On Monday, my lord, we have, I believe, successfully arranged for the virtual hearing
Yes.
for 3 of the similar fact witnesses who are based in other parts of South Africa to testify, but we will do so in this court.
Yeah.
And Big Beat Productions have, in fact, arranged the visuals and the audio so that it'll be live streamed into the court,
Okay.
and they will be available from 10 a.m.
Well, thank you. The proceedings are therefore adjourned to Monday. Can't remember the date now. What's the date on Monday? 30th. Yes, 30th. At 10. Thank you. Court is adjourned.